tea on hand. So thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I have to say it's one of the most peculiar public speaking experiences I've ever had, just talking at a screen and hoping that you're out there. It would be helpful, I think, if someone just said, yes, we are. Maybe you could type that, one of you, just so I know that I'm not talking just to my screen. Yes, we are. Excellent. Okay. So I'm going to be talking today about commercial whaling. And I've said commercial because there are other kinds, and I may not have time to get to those, although perhaps there'll be questions. I'll talk about whale conservation, and I'm going to be talking about the International Whaling Commission, which is an international body that oversees both of those things, whaling and whale conservation. First of all, who is this strange Brit who's talking to you? My name is Sue, and I know I'm talking to science classes, but or maybe social science classes, but I'm actually an attorney, a lawyer. But my work is really at the intersection of science and law, and I should probably add politics too. I guess you'd say I work in public policy, and my job essentially is to advocate for whales, for their protection, mainly to governments who are members of treaties, and I'm going to come and talk about that later. But to advocate that whales have greater protection from the various threats that they face. I've been doing this for about 22 years, working for a range of conservation non-profits, and I'm currently a consultant because I work part-time, and I'm working for the Animal Welfare Institute, which is a Washington, DC based group that works on animal welfare and conservation issues. I should say, if you have questions, I'm peeping down at the box on the left. I'll see them come in. And I may ignore them until the end because I have a presentation to get through, but if something piques my interest, I may digress a little and answer a question. We'll just see how that goes. So I'm going to be talking about whaling, and I could spend the whole time talking about the history of whaling, so I've had to truncate this quite considerably. So brief lesson. Many of you will know that whaling's been practiced for centuries. What you might not know is that it's actually been practiced for thousands of years. It actually predates written history, and I've included there a petroglyph of a whale from a cave. I don't know where, I just found that online, but it just illustrates that whales were certainly taken before written history. And we assume that the first one was found on a beach, stranded, dead or alive, and that some opportunistic soul decided to see how it tasted. Whether it tasted good, I don't know, but it certainly provided some significant nutrition. Whales are very high in fat and high in protein. Certainly, if you live in northern latitudes, they provide a whole bounty of nutrition that you may not have access to through other meat or protein sources. So people realized that catching whales would be a useful thing to do. They would have started with nets, they would have started to use spears. But whaling wasn't an organized activity for a few more centuries. It took until about the 10th century for people to be organized in terms of their hunting of whales. And by then, they weren't just hunting them to eat them. They realized that if you boil the blubber, so as you probably know, whales have a thick layer of fat around them to keep them warm in the water. If you boil that blubber, if you render it down, you get an oil that has some remarkable properties, and I'm going to come back to those. But the point back for the Basque people of northern Spain was that that oil was used as a lighting source, which, as I'm going to come back to, changes lives. So those people, those Basque people in the Bay of Biscay in northern Spain, they started out in their coastal waters in small boats, and they were targeting right whales, which are now critically endangered. And thanks to the practice of these Basque people and every other whaling operation since, what they did, of course, was to overfish their resource. They took all the whales in their local waters. And they called them right whales because they apparently were the right whales to hunt. They're quite a chubby species. They're not one of the faster moving whales. They were easy to catch. And when you kill them, they don't sink, which makes them the right whale to take. They took all the whales in their local waters, and then, as is always the practice with whaling, they set off elsewhere to find more. And as they moved, they went north up into the North Atlantic. And as they travelled, they took their whaling practices with them, taught other people. So they taught the French, they taught the British, they taught the Norwegians. They eventually crossed over into North America. They taught the Canadians, they taught the Americans, and whaling spread through the Northern Hemisphere, at least in those early centuries. By the 1600s, whaling was becoming increasingly mechanized. It was becoming very competitive. We were beginning to see national fleets, not just individuals hunting, but whole countries had organized into national fleets. The steam vessel was invented, a much faster moving ship than a sailing boat. It could take the faster moving whales. And whaling got more efficient when somebody, a Norwegian, invented the exploding harpoon, which I'm going to explain how that works later, but it meant that you lost many fewer whales than you were when you were using what we call a cold harpoon and non-exploding one. In the 16 to 1800s, countries, because there was such competition, began to set up remote shore stations for their whaling. So partly perhaps because they'd already fished out the whales in their local waters, or just because competition was so fierce, they would establish shore stations, often now in the southern hemisphere, in the Antarctic region in South America, Australia, where they would send vessels, drop people off, hunt whales in the appropriate whaling season, and then bring them all back to sell later. So whaling was becoming global at that point. And in terms of the species taken, it was the sperm whale that was the main target around those couple of centuries. Just have a drink of tea, hang on a second. By the 1900s, we could really begin to call whaling industrial, and I've included there a picture of a whaling boat, what we call a factory ship from, I think that's about 1930. And you can see, I don't know whether you can see my cursor, but at the back, there's a big hole, and that's where a whale, once it had been harpooned, would be winched up a slipway into the factory ship. It wouldn't have been hunted by the ship. This would travel with the whaling whale catcher boats. And inside there would be a factory, a processing operation to render the whales down on board and then store hundreds of gallons, thousands of gallons of oil in barrels. And those big ships would set off for months at a time, and essentially, effectively down to the southern hemisphere. So this map actually explains what I mean here. So perhaps you know that whales, or at least the big baleen species, which were being hunted in commercial whaling, either live in the northern or the southern hemisphere. They don't tend to cross the equator in their migratory routes. So these pink or purple splodges that you can see, this is just humpback whales. These are their breeding grounds. So at the right season, they would travel thousands of miles to the breeding grounds, and the same one every year. They always go back to the same one. Once they've had their babies and the babies are strong enough and big enough to travel with the mothers, they would then set off to their feeding grounds, which in the southern hemisphere is around Antarctica, because those cold, freezing waters of Antarctica are incredibly productive of the krill and the plankton that those large whales feed on. So because there's so much ocean in the southern hemisphere, there are just more whale species, and they would be congregating in the Antarctic summer to feed in huge numbers, massive numbers. And that's where the whaling fleets would head, in huge competition with each other. And the result, of course, was absolute decimation of the whale stocks. So in the 1900s alone, I just had to put this figure in, 2.9 million whales were killed. That's phenomenal. And you have to think that whales aren't fish. Whales are long-lived, they're slow breeding, they don't have their babies until they're a good age, they don't have many babies, many calves. So they don't recover quickly from decimation. And when you're taking tens of thousands of whales at a time, you have a devastating impact, not just on them immediately, but over the long term, because the recovery will be so slow. So of those almost 3 million whales, almost 80% were in Antarctica, which is absolutely astonishing. In the peak of commercial whaling in the 1960s, over 60,000 whales a year were being taken by a handful of nations at that point. And the impact, as I said, was devastating. Some populations reduced by as much as 90%, and the blue whale, the largest species, we lost more than 98% of those. And why? What were we taking those whales for? It certainly wasn't meat at that point. Excuse me. So at the background of this slide, you can see something that looks a little furry at the bottom, but has thicker strands at the top. That's whale baleen. That's in the throat of one of these large whales. They have these, it's made of keratin, like your fingernails. It hangs down in the back of their throat. So as they feed, huge amounts of water, and then these little microorganisms wash into their mouth. And this stuff, this baleen, filters it. Now, it has amazing properties. It's very flexible, but also very strong, and perhaps you know it was used to make ladies' corsets a few hundred years ago, and it had a huge impact on the whales because it was such a huge fashion at the time. But more significant and longer term, what we were taking whales for was their oil. And as you can see in the top corner, oil was used to make candle wax. It apparently doesn't produce much smoke, it's clean burning, doesn't smell, which can be a problem with some candle sources apparently. But as we moved into the Industrial Revolution, this is when whales became a huge resource. So you've got to think about the 1800s. Every country was competing with each other for industrial development. And a huge advantage you could have would be if you could run your factories, not just during the day, but at night too. And there wasn't electricity at that point. So to be able to actually provide light in the factories and then light street lamps so that your workers could get home safely would give you and give your city, give your country an enormous edge over competitors. And whales were literally greasing the wheels and lighting the lights of the Industrial Revolution. They had a huge impact, particularly in Northern Europe, in the UK in particular. By the beginning of the 1900s, whale oil was used to make the glycerin-based explosives, not this is dynamite, but glycerin-based explosives that were used in the First and the Second World War. But as the century moved on, it was the emollient property of oil that became important. So emollient means that it's a good lubricant, it has a slippery quality, which is important in lipsticks, as you can see there. But it also was an important lubricant in the making of fine items like watches and clocks. It also has another amazing property that it freezes at very, very low temperatures. So I have no evidence of this, but apparently NASA had, or at least maybe still has, stockpiles of oil from sperm whales, which I'll explain in a second. Because that freezes at such low temperatures, it's extraordinarily useful in space exploration. It can be used to lubricate the moving parts of rockets. So as I said, it's not just whale oil from the blubber. There's a remarkable product in the head cavity of a sperm whale. It's basically like a huge tank full of this liquid, which made sperm whales an enormous target of industrial whaling for centuries, because it's the spermaceti, that has the most remarkable and most valuable properties. And of course, all those things have petrochemical or plant-based alternatives today. But for a few hundred years, whales were literally providing food and energy and, well, as you can tell, amazing resource for countries that were developing fast. So this, I think, helps explain, it gives some context of what that decimation was. Look at the key at the bottom. You can see, that's what I think, I can't see, I've got my last one, that says 5 meters, I think. Yes, that would be right. And this doesn't show the biggest whale, the blue whale, which would be wider than the whole slide. But it gives you a sense of the different sizes of whales, and the exploitation tended to go in reverse order of size. So it made more sense as an economy of scale to hunt the biggest whales first. You just get more stuff from them. So the blue whales were the first to be decimated. Then the then the fin whales, then the sperm whales with this big head cavity full of the spermaceti. And then whalers would, as they ran out of different species, would move down to the smaller ones through the sei whales, the Brodus whales, the humpback whales. Until this little guy here, this is the minke whale, which is small, and this is the only whale really that was left in any commercially viable numbers, and it's the target of commercial whaling that continues today. So those whales, one by one, were decimated. What was needed, because countries just weren't able to regulate themselves, there was just such competition, they weren't able to set limits on their own hunting because they would have lost out to a competitor. So what was needed was a treaty. A treaty is effectively an international agreement, like a contract between individuals, where a country, once it's joined, has committed to behave in a certain way, and typically there are penalties if it doesn't, similar to a contract. But when you have countries who don't necessarily want to be constrained or have limits set on them, but have to come together to negotiate a treaty, the details, the terms of that treaty have to be attractive enough for those key players to come together and then to join it, to ratify it, and then to comply with it. So through the 1920s and 30s, there were several attempts to get the key whaling nations of the day together to create a treaty, and they failed, they went nowhere. Because, as I said, the motivation was but not protection of the whales, it was the interest of the countries. It was either their territorial interest, because by sending their fleets down into different oceans, they could claim territory, or it was national interest, because they were in competition with each other, or corporate interest, because peoples, individuals, and companies were making a ton of money out of whales. So it took until 1945, and I've asked why that date's significant, and you can't answer me because I can't hear you, but it was right at the end of the Second World War, which I think is remarkable. It was the US that finally called the 15 whaling nations of the day together. And these countries had been at war months beforehand, but they came to Washington, D.C., and they finally managed to negotiate a treaty. We call it the International Convention, and that means treaty, for the regulation of whaling. And that treaty established a body of member states called the International Whaling Commission, or the IWC, that has met every year since, almost every year since. And here are the 10 white guys, as is typical of the time, signing the treaty. And although that's typical, what wasn't typical was actually the content of this treaty. Although I'm going to come to its weaknesses, I think it's important to acknowledge that it was the first treaty of its time that actually acknowledged the need to protect a resource, a living resource, for its own sake, not just for the sake of the individuals or companies or countries that wanted to exploit it. And that was fairly groundbreaking. And it's a treaty will always have objects and purpose. That sort of defines what it exists for. And the ICRW, that International Convention for the Regulation of Whaling, doesn't just include a mandate to manage whaling, it actually explicitly includes a mandate to conserve whales, which, as I say, was fairly novel for the era. This helps to know what kind of treaty was it. So there are two kinds of international treaty. There's the kind like the Climate Change Convention that you've been hearing about recently, which makes its big decisions by consensus. Every member, there can be hundreds, have to agree on every measure that it takes, or every important measure that it takes. And that, of course, takes time, and it takes a lot of compromises. And it means that the outcome, if there is one, and often there won't be, is the lowest common denominator. It's the lowest measure, lowest commitment that all countries are prepared to make. So often, those commitments can be weak. And then there's the treaty that makes its big decisions by majority rule, and most fisheries agreements are modelled on this kind. So for this type, to make a big decision that binds its members, either 2/3 or 3/4 of the parties have to vote in favour, and then it binds everybody. So whether you voted for it or not, whether you abstained or voted against, whether you like it or not, you're bound by it. At least that's the theory. So the IWC, because there was no chance back in the 1940s that the parties who came together were going to agree anything by consensus, they decided they would have a majority rule treaty. So the IWC, to make decisions to protect whales or to manage them, takes a 3/4 majority to adopt a quota, to decide how many whales can be killed, to open and close a season. So it's typically not allowed to hunt whales when they're breeding, because then they're killing the babies. If you kill the pregnant mothers, you kill the babies. If you kill the nursing mothers, you kill the babies. So there's usually agreement not to hunt in breeding season. So the IWC would say no whaling or sperm whales between June and September. It could agree to protect particular populations but allow hunting on others, and then it would take a 3/4 majority decision to close whaling in a particular area permanently, or at least until 3/4 was achieved to overturn it, so to establish a sanctuary. So the question is then, of course, if you can be outvoted, what's the incentive to join, other than access to the resource that you want? What would be the incentive for a country to join a majority rule treaty? Well, unfortunately, as we lawyers know all too well, you have to build loopholes in to get the countries to agree to be part of it. And that's sadly what the IWC or the founders did. The first thing they did was to create what we call an objection procedure. It's a huge loophole. It means that if you don't like a decision, so let's say you don't like the fact that the sperm whale season has been closed down this year, so the quota has gone to 0. If you don't like that, you can lodge an objection. It's just a legal statement that you make that's put on the record. And that legal statement actually exempts you from the effect of that decision. As I say, it's a huge loophole. And then the founders, and we ask ourselves why every day, created in Article 8 the scientific whaling provision, which is probably the biggest loophole in the whaling convention. So a couple of lawyer words here in red. This provision applies notwithstanding anything else contained in the convention. So it prevails over anything, any regulation, any ban, it prevails over all of them. And it permits any government, any member state, to allow its nationals a special permit authorising that national to kill whales. That's the simple read of it. And then another lawyer's word, any whales taken under these special permits shall, not may, shall, you must, as far as practicable, process the products of that research. So you can kill the whales in any number, because the number you take notwithstands anything else in the convention, and then you shall process them and deal with them as you see fit. So basically, you're giving the governments the opportunity to kill as many whales as they want, do some research, and then sell the product. It basically allows commercial whaling to happen, even when there isn't a commercial quota that exists. So here we have, I'm going to whip through these because they're not so interesting perhaps to you, but there are other problems with the whaling convention. There was no efficient observer scheme. You can't send a whaling vessel thousands of miles out to sea and not have somebody independent on board to make sure that the reporting you do is accurate. There wasn't a very effective international observer scheme. There were some national inspectors, but the IWC wasn't doing a good job of having independent observers checking that the data being reported. It has no compliance mechanism. That's a technical term for no way of punishing anybody. So if a country was caught for catching more whales than its quota allowed, only that government could punish itself, punish its whalers. The Commission, the IWC, has no power to punish anybody. It has no dispute resolution mechanism. So I'll give you an example. So maybe a quota of 100 minke whales would be set in a certain part of the North Pacific. Russia and Japan wouldn't be given those quotas. They would have to share that quota. The quota is on the whales, not for the countries. They would have to come up with an agreement between them that, Russia gets 50, Japan gets 50. If they fell out over that, the IWC has no way of mediating their dispute. They'd have to work that out for themselves, and that would cause huge problems. And then the Commission had no independent legal advice, which meant that if there was a disagreement among the parties, for example, on what something meant, they didn't know how to interpret something the Commission had agreed, there was no independent lawyer to say this is what was meant. Each country would bring their own lawyers, which is never a good thing, and a whole meeting would be spent arguing over the meaning of one word. So what was the result of all these institutional problems? Well, of course, it was overhunting and it was underreporting. And just to give you an example, the Soviet Union killed more than 90,000 more whales than it actually reported over a very short period of time. And we're still actually trying to unravel the Soviet whaling data. It may actually have been worse than that. So data got falsified. Countries would cover up the fact they caught a whale that was too small to have been legal, or it was the wrong species. They'd report that it was a minke whale when it was actually a humpback. Or they'd misreport where they were hunting, the fact they were hunting in a closed area. And of course the impact was that decline, one species after another, continued through the 1960s. So things began to get a little better then. I mean, whales were still being killed in ridiculous numbers. But the world changed in the 1960s. And one of the important evolutions in society in general was an acknowledgement of animal welfare, that animals feel pain, feel fear like we do. And it was recognized back in that decade that whaling is inherently cruel. So just to kind of explain that to you, if you think about how we kill, at least in the US, how we kill large mammals for food, we do it in a controlled environment. You're in a slaughterhouse. Your objective is to render that cow, for example, instantaneously either dead or insensible. So it's unconscious, it's unable to feel the pain. And you typically do that, maybe you've seen, you deliver huge percussive, so huge force to the brain, to the forehead. Obviously mistakes can be made, but it's a very controlled environment. At sea, you're in about the least controlled environment you can possibly in. So when you're killing a whale, and you can see here, guy with an exploding harpoon cannon firing at a whale. He's standing on a moving platform He's on a shifting sea, and this sea state in this picture is relatively calm. I've seen pictures of much choppier waters with whales being hunted. And of course the choppy water with the white cap to make it harder to see the whales in the first place. So you're aiming your harpoon cannon into a moving target. And of course a whale lives underwater. It only surfaces just for a few seconds, and only its blowhole needs to come out of the water for it to breathe, and it's gone again. And for you to deliver massive percussive force to that whale's brain, you've got to be an extraordinarily good shot. And the circumstances are so uncontrolled that that's not always the case. So the reality is that some whales, many whales, I would say, can take minutes, many minutes to die. And they're not dying from that massive percussive force to their brain, they're dying from shock or from blood loss. Perhaps worse still, if the rope breaks, I mean, you can see the rope between the harpooner and the whale. The harpoon hits the whale. As it enters, it detonates. You don't want it to be in the body of the whale, because then you basically blow the whale to pieces and you're losing meat. You want it to be in a part of the brain where it's actually going to be close, an animal that's going to be close to the brain and kill it. But it's got to actually lodge. The grenade goes in, explodes, and it sends out barbs that hook into the body of the whale, so it shouldn't pull out, but it does sometimes. Or the rope breaks, and whales will be lost, typically mortally wounded, to die a horrible death. And it was acknowledged back in the 60s that these are sentient creatures. They're social, they're mammals like us. They can feel pain, they can feel fear. And a movement grew outside the IWC in the public domain, but inside the Commission too, that it was just wrong to kill them. 1970s, the birth of the environment movement and these lovely hippies. And you'll know, whales became an icon for the environment movement. Save the whale was one of the statements of that decade. It was acknowledged whaling was inhumane, it was unsustainable, it was poorly regulated, something had to be done. And this movement grew, and it was generated by the public, and it was helped by non-governmental organizations, groups like ours, the ones I work for, that eventually brought that message of concern to governments. And finally, in 1982, enough governments, and it certainly wasn't all, there was certainly not consensus, but enough managed to get together a 3/4 majority to impose a moratorium, which means temporary, it's not a permanent ban, but they imposed a ban on commercial whaling of all species. There were 10 whaling nations at the time, 7 of them gave up. They were given a 3-year period to phase out. By the third year, 86 was the end of it. Those 7 had given up, repurposed their vessels, found alternative employment for their whalers. And look what happened. So you see the figures of the whaling numbers come down in 1986. It was a huge victory. I was old enough to remember it, and I wish I did. Sadly, I don't. But it would have been a huge deal when that happened. But it wasn't the end. That's the problem. It was forced on the whaling nations who didn't want it, and 3 of them didn't. And of course, as I've explained, they have ways around it. So although whaling came down to that almost zero in 1986, you can see how it's crept up since. So where are we now? The 3 nations still hunting. Let me just check anybody's got any. Now, the 3 nations still hunting. Let me just check anybody's got any. Nobody's got any questions for me yet. So 3 countries still whaling today. Japan, probably the most famous. It has 2 research programs. It doesn't conduct commercial whaling technically, although of course it's commercial. It has 3 special permit research programs, 2 research programs. One in Antarctica, which is the most famous because it's in a sanctuary that was declared by the IWC back in the 90s. And one in the North Pacific, which I actually am very concerned about. It's taking whales from populations which are quite endangered and taking more species, but it just doesn't get the public attention that the Antarctic one gets. So Japan is taking 4 species in total. Its quotas, things have changed, and if you've got questions, I can come back to that. Things have changed with Japan's whaling in the last couple of years because of a decision at the International Court of Justice. But it's taking, between both those funds, about 600 whales a year. Norway did lodge an objection to the moratorium and resume whaling shortly thereafter. It takes about 600 a year, at least 660 taken last year. sets much higher quotas, but doesn't usually achieve those high quotas. There's some political posturing in those high quotas that it sets. And then Iceland. Iceland's an interesting case. So it's been a major whaling nation for a very long time. Iceland only has a population of about 300,000 people, but it was a huge player, still a huge player in the whaling arena. It actually left the International Whaling Commission in objection to the moratorium, didn't want to be dealing with that, and did stop whaling for a few years, but it came back in the early 2000s, rejoined the IWC, very controversial decision to allow it to rejoin. And it's taking fin whales, which are an endangered species, and it's taking a lot of them, 155 taken last year, sets a quota of 150 each year, and a high quota set of minkies, although it doesn't take that many. It doesn't take that many because this is appalling. So, as I said, it's a small population in Iceland. The locals don't have any interest in eating whale meat. But there's 20 or so minke whales a year going somewhere, and surveys have been done that show that they're actually being eaten by tourists. And it's astonishing to me. Iceland has a huge whale watching industry. Hundreds of thousands of people go to Iceland every year and watch whales. And then enough of them are getting off whaling boats, going into Reykjavik and eating whale meat. It's astonishing. But the big hunt, of course, is for the fin whales. There's enormous fin whales. And Iceland isn't taking those fin whales for itself, it's taking them for Japan. And since about 2008, Iceland has exported 5,000 tons of fin whale meat to Japan because the market exists there. That's it now. Those are the only markets for meat. Iceland, Norway, and Japan. And those markets are falling. And as I'm sure you aren't interested particularly in the recipes and the food that your grandparents might be, still talking about with nostalgia. Same is true in these countries, particularly in Japan. Young people in Japan aren't interested in eating whale meat. But there are enough people who are, older people who are still, and the government, maybe we'll come back to this in the questions, for some reason is intent on keeping its whaling industry alive, heavily subsidises it, and fights astonishingly hard at the Whaling Commission to overturn the moratorium so that it could do commercial whaling legally again, and even buys the votes of small developing countries to try and get up to that 3/4 majority of votes that it would need to overturn the moratorium. Does that by giving development aid to small countries in return for their votes at the IWC. So I think the interest in whale meat is declining, but I've said here, don't forget about the whale oil. Don't forget those amazing properties that whale oil has. And a relatively new discovery is that it may have pharmaceutical potential. So we know that omega-3 is important in humans' diet. We don't make it ourselves. We need to get it from our diet, and it is obviously found in fish, but it's also found in animals that eat fish. It's found in seals and it's found in whales. And scientists in Norway are exploring whether there's potential in extracting omega-3 from whale oil on a commercially viable basis. It's also used in animal feed, not on a huge scale yet, but I fear that it will be. As you know, we're fishing the oceans empty of fish, and instead we're farming them. But you have to feed those farm fish something, and you don't want to be taking fish, or we are, but you shouldn't be taking fish out of the sea to feed fish in fish farms. So there's definitely interest in using that very nutritionally rich whale to feed farmed salmon and other fish. And then fuel, it's oil. It's not happening on a large scale, but certainly at least one of the whaling vessels in Iceland is running on biofuel that's made from whales. No, I'm not looking in the right place for questions. So what I'm going to do, how are we at 8:30? Okay, I'm in good time here. What I want to do, this is relevant to the IWC because as it manages whaling, it also manages conservation. It is doing conservation work, which is absolutely critically important. So it addresses other threats to whales, which, to be honest, are far more serious to them in the long term than whaling is. Whaling we can deal with there. Whaling we could stop tomorrow if we had the political will to do it. These threats we can't deal with tomorrow. These take a longer term investment. First one, so climate change. We all know that our planet is warming. But it's not just a matter of temperature rising. We're feeling it on land, it's happening in the sea too. And that affects marine processes too. So we have at the poles, seasonally, the ice grows, the ice contracts, the ice grows, it contracts. There are ecosystems within that ice process that's critically important for a lot of Arctic species or species that feed at the Arctic. And as the ice doesn't come back or melts, leaving the entire Arctic empty of ice this summer, for the first time, vessels were traveling through the Arctic. Iceland sent whale meat to Japan through the Northwest Passage for the first time through the Arctic. That ice is not coming back, and it's having an effect on the species that whales rely on. So it affects productivity, it affects ocean currents. So the whale's prey, when it's fish rather than the smaller plankton and krill, as ocean currents change, the movements of those prey species change, and whales just aren't finding food that they're expecting to at certain times of the year. The ocean is becoming more acidic as it warms. So cumulatively, all these threats are having an effect on the food web, which the whales are at the top of. We're having a devastating impact on whales through our fishing. So cetaceans is the collective term for whales, dolphins, and porpoises. I'm not just talking about whales here. But at least 300,000 cetaceans a year are drowning in fishing nets, in fishing gear and nets. That's a ridiculous number. And the ones that don't die, that become entangled, will, if the stuff isn't cut off them, will die through infection, or just because the weight of carrying this stuff around. This is a fin whale, I think, that's hauling a load of nets, which weighs a ridiculous amount of water. Sometimes you see whales with ropes around their mouths, towing huge crab pots behind them, lobster pots behind them. So our desire for fish isn't just taking whales' food away from them, it's actually having a direct, very tangible welfare impact on them too, with these awful entanglements. Entanglement also comes from other marine debris, not just fishing gear. This little dolphin had a rubber ring that was discarded from a ship or ended up on the beach and got washed out to sea, and you can see the awful impact it had on its neck. I don't know whether it's probably in captivity there and being taken care of, but that shouldn't have to happen. Marine debris doesn't just wrap you up, it also gets swallowed. And this, I'm not sure if you can see this very clearly, this top right-hand picture is the contents of a sperm whale's stomach. Now, the sperm whale got sick and died, and an autopsy was done on it. This was in its stomach, so you can see a huge amount of rope. I think that's a tin can. White plastic bags, shopping bags, big black trash bin liners, as I would call them. Just a stomach full of crap, basically, that this whale would have killed it, either because it was so full it couldn't get the fish in, or it was being poisoned by the stuff in there, and it's just horrible death. We're seeing more and more of those deaths. Whales are also being hit as the sheer numbers of vessels on the ocean increases. They're either intercepting or they're following the migratory paths of whales, and this is a picture of a humpback that survived, I'm not sure how long, but got hit by a boat. They're being impacted by pollution too, and you think of chemical pollution, we don't think about noise pollution. And think about how whales, their environment, their underwater environment, is an environment of hearing. They communicate by sound, because they can't see each other over long distances in the water. So they're communicating by sound, but they also find their way around, they echolocate by sound too. And the sea is an incredibly noisy environment these days. We have military using sonar to detect enemy submarines. We have oil and gas exploration, again using sonar to send vast booming sounds down to the seabed to see what echoes back up if oil and gas reserves are under the seabed. We have noise from vessels. All this noise cumulatively disturbs the natural behavior of whales. It disturbs their feeding. They might move away from a feeding ground because it gets noisy. It might disturb their breeding. It certainly impacts their migratory route. They try and avoid the noise, and sometimes it even is causing physical damage to their ears. We've seen images of beaked whales. They're not this kind. They're whales with teeth. They're quite different morphologically. Where the ear cavity is just blown to bits by the sound. It's just ridiculous. And then chemical pollution. So whales, as I said, are at the top of the food chain, food web. And toxins that are consumed by microscopic organisms that are in turn eaten by fish, by bigger fish, bigger fish, bigger fish. With the whales at the top of that food chain, they're bioaccumulating. Those levels of heavy metals and persistent organic compounds increasing with each trophic level. So that at the top of the food chain, the whales have very high levels of mercury and other heavy metals and PCBs and other persistent compounds in their flesh and in their tissues, which is having significant health impacts on some of them. We're actually seeing direct impacts, cancers and loss of fertility, other diseases on whales. And then, of course, if you eat the whales, we're also seeing direct causation between mothers who eat whale products from certain species, not all, but in the Faroe Islands in Northern Europe, people eat pilot whales, which have very high levels of contaminants. It's been a very long-term study showing that the children, and it's a big cohort of a few hundred kids over, I think it's now a 13-year study, they're demonstrating serious developmental problems in those children. The children whose mothers ate whale meat when they were pregnant, or even before they were pregnant. So I guess I thought it might be helpful to tell you what you can do to help if I've got you concerned about all of this stuff. Never underestimate the power of a letter. I'm sure your parents tell you to write your thank you letters, and a letter is better than a text. Do that. Don't use the lazy means. You get a piece of paper out and write a letter. It gets read and it has much more impact. Write a letter to your representatives, whether you're voting for them or not. Write to the president. Tell them that the US's whaling policy is really important to you, and that we want the US to take the strongest policy against the whaling nations that it possibly can, and do the right thing for whale conservation too, but it typically is. We have to push them harder on their whaling policy. Don't buy fish from companies that are linked to whalers. If we've got time, I'm going to show you a short video. It's related to a campaign that we're running, trying to make the connection between the fish that you might buy in supermarkets, grocery stores in the US, and the company in Iceland doing the whaling. There's a direct link between that whaling company and the fish that we can buy in the US. We can expose those links. People don't buy that fish, it's going to have an economic impact on that whaling company. Let us know, and I can provide contact details. If you find whale meat on sale in restaurants, you shouldn't in the US. It's illegal, but it's happened, so keep your eyes out. And if you find other whale products in stores, the US has very strict laws about which whale products can be traded and whether they can come from overseas, whether they can be exported, whether they can be sold between states. If you see whale products on sale in stores, just let us know. We can work out whether it's legal or not. Simple things. You saw that trash, don't pollute, pick up your rubbish. Don't pick up, if you're at the coast, I want to find a picture of the nasty stuff that you see on beaches these days. And it's mainly plastic bags. Pick up that stuff at the coast. And then just to go back a couple of pictures, I didn't explain this. These are microbeads under a microscope. So those of you who are using face washes with exfoliants in them, most of those exfoliants are tiny, tiny, rough pieces of plastic. And those wash down the sink, and those wash out to sea, and they are found in amazing quantities in every ocean now, and they're being found, of course, in the stomachs of fish, and plastics are toxic. Those are contributing to those health effects that we're seeing in the cetaceans and the whales and dolphins and porpoises. So don't use cosmetics and personal care products containing microbeads. Many states are banning them, which is great. If you look on the ingredients, make sure it uses salt or some other exfoliant that breaks down when it's wet. So those are some ideas. That's the movie I'll show you if we have time, and there's okay. Now I have to see if I can read questions from you. You go back up here a little. Okay, yes, you're here. 20 students. Okay, sorry, it's just taken me a while. So Bridget is asking, how difficult, aggravating, yes it is it to persuade those who participate in whaling, like Japan, who believe it's justifiable since it's been in their history for so long? That's a good question. So yes, it's true. As I said, whaling has been practiced for a long time. You know, for Inuit people, and I haven't talked about subsistence whaling, thousands of years of sustainable whaling for subsistence, for traditional cultural purposes. Japan, yes, it does have a tradition of coastal whaling. The smaller whales and dolphins, some minke whales. What it doesn't have, and it actually acknowledges this, it does not have a long cultural tradition of pelagic, which means deep sea whaling. It doesn't have a tradition of industrial whaling. That actually came about, ironically, at the end of the Second World War, when Japan surrendered and the US took control of Japan's sort of development. The US actually encouraged Japan to refit some fishing vessels as whaling vessels and go hunt some whales because they weren't farming. Their fishing fleet wasn't up to much. But, you know, in terms of effort, you can get more protein out of a whaling expedition than you can perhaps from a fishing expedition. And the US encouraged Japan to do this deep sea, long distance commercial hunting. So Japan can't argue that it's protecting a cultural tradition by continuing commercial whaling. So that's a bogus argument. But I agree, it is very aggravating that we have to keep explaining that. And then scientific whaling, in my opinion, isn't it kind of ironic, although for different purposes the outcome is ultimately the same? Yes, yes, I mean it is, and we don't know why the founders included that language in the treaty. Perhaps because it's reasonable if you needed to do, I'm talking about the 1940s, and we didn't have the techniques we have these days, like DNA analysis and other, you know, scientific research techniques. If you wanted to study something, you killed it, basically. So I suppose back in the 40s, it was reasonable to include a provision to allow some whales to be hunted, to examine them, examine their physiology, or to examine what they ate, or, you know, that kind of thing. But the founders, there's no evidence from the documents that are on file still from their discussions around the founding, the drafting of the treaty, that they ever intended it to be, you know, a loophole to catch whales for commercial purposes under this guise of science. It's a nonsense, but it's legal. That's the trouble. It's written in the treaty, notwithstanding anything else. That language is just, you know, a disaster. But what has happened, and I alluded to this earlier, back in 2014, Australia, supported by New Zealand, actually took Japan to court, to the ultimate court, the International Court of Justice, which is a UN body that can address disputes between nations. And not Australia and New Zealand made the argument that Japan's whaling is bogus, and the court actually did decide that yes, Japan, that the programs that Japan had devised for the whaling that it was doing were not for the purposes of science, and it told Japan to stop those programs until it could recreate a program that was consistent with what the IWC expected. And Japan did stop for a year. That's why I mentioned that the numbers were different recently. Japan did stop its Antarctic program, so that the lawsuit was just about Antarctica. It did stop that hunt for a year, but sadly it just repurposed its program. It's just as bogus as ever, and they started hunting again. They've gone back down to Antarctica this winter. So we won, but we lost as well. So Lauren, there are many threats to whales, yes. Is taiji, yes, is taiji a real threat in the sheer number of their taking? So, for those of you who don't know, Taiji is a small town in Japan. It is one of the communities that has a tradition of hunting small whales and dolphins. What they're doing now is hunting mainly bottlenose dolphins, other species too, not just for meat. In fact, the dolphins are worth whole lot more per head alive, sold into captivity, and these poor things, they're being, you know, caught in, maybe you've seen, astonishingly cruel circumstances, seeing their pod mates, their families, butchered in front of them in this cove. And if you know about the movie The Cove, please see it, it's amazing. So they're herded into this cove. The ones that aren't pretty, aren't the right age, are butchered for meat. And then the ones that are the right sex, the right age, the pretty ones get pulled out alive and sent off to dolphinaria all over Japan, and now increasingly into China and the rest of Asia. In terms of the threat, we don't know. This is the problem. We don't have very much data because Japan isn't collecting it, and these whales are in their waters. They would be responsible for the research. We don't know what the status is of those dolphin populations. There are certainly concerns about the other porpoises they're taking in other hunts, so the Dall's porpoise and the striped dolphin, which Japan takes in a handheld harpoon hunt. They're not using the big exploding cannons, they hand throw harpoons. They're catching unsustainable numbers of dolphins, striped dolphins and Dall's porpoises. So there's good reasons to suspect that the sustainability argument also applies to taiji, that it's not just awfully inhumane and just wrong to take them for captivity, it's probably also unsustainable. So what are the consequences, this is from Plymouth, if someone kills a whale, commercial cargo ships, fishing vessels? Oh, that's a good question. I think it would depend, I'm not the right person to ask, I work on international stuff. If somebody kills a whale in the US, you know, I've got to pass on that, and I will do some research, and if I can, maybe through Deb, I can answer that one directly. I'm not sure what the penalties are. If it's unintentional, if it's intentional, clearly there are penalties. We have very strict protection of whales from harassment and kills and everything else that you could possibly do to them intentionally. Unintentionally, I'm not sure what the consequences would be for a ship captain, for example. Do I have cause for optimism when it comes to positive reform for the IWC? I think I have to, partly because I've been doing this so long. I think you've got to look at it over a long period, which is why I think that picture, the graph of the moratorium helps. If I look at it over 10 years, even over the 20 years that I've been doing this, God, it gets hard. It's a grind. You know, the small victories we really have to celebrate because they are small. But look, I mean, these were the numbers of whales that were being killed just in the 1900s. We've brought it down, although it's higher than we want it to be now. It's come down. We know that interest in whale meat is declining. I think as long as we can maintain an international ban on trade in whale products, and that's not through the Whaling Commission, that's through another treaty, but trade in international commercial trade in whale products is prohibited. If we can maintain that ban, that's going to be huge. I should explain that despite their ban, it does have loopholes too, of course. So Norway, Iceland and Japan all have objections, they're called reservations in this treaty, but they exempted themselves from that trade ban, so they can trade whale products with each other. But it's limited to those three. You know, China could be an enormous market for whale products, for whale oil in particular, but it cannot import it because it was trade ban, and China was banned by that. So that, you know, that gives me, maybe not hope, but it gives me comfort that we're likely to retain that ban because, you know, the world wants that to be maintained. Yeah, I mean, my focus is whaling. I'm not a scientist, so those environmental threats are not my area. I do, and my colleagues who are scientists do lose hope sometimes that we are messing up our planet. And while, as I said, we can stop whaling relatively easily, it's a political decision. Stopping climate change, stopping pollution, yeah, that's a whole other issue. And you know, the whales are suffering. The marine system, the whole ecosystem is suffering, and it's, you know, it's our fault. Oh, thank you for the thanks. That's very nice. So I've missed a few questions. I'm skipping about. So that's what. I'm going to ask some. So Bridget's asked me another one. Let me see if I've got somebody else's question here. Do you attend all? I do, yes. I've been going since 1994. I feel like I'm the elder statesman now. I was a bright young thing back at my first one. And I've got to say to you guys, we're all getting old. We need you. We need people. We need lawyers. We need scientists. We need social scientists. We need people to, you know, get your degree, get your master's, get a PhD too if you can. But give up your time, give up your energy to volunteer too. I mean, this is how I got into this. I was an attorney. I was practicing law, commercial law in London. And I ended up doing some volunteer work for a conservation group because I had some spare time, and that's the conservation group that I worked for 10 years. I never went back to practicing law, at least not commercial law again. Offered up my skills. I might not have found a job with that group to start with, but they wanted us to be volunteers. Intern, volunteer, find ways to support these small non-profit groups that are doing amazing things. We're the conscience of these countries who make these decisions. The public you're the public, you have strong views on whaling. We collectively as non-profits, as NGOs, represent those views to governments. We have a lot of power. I mean, the whaling nations don't like this. Maybe power is not the right word. We have influence. We can help do research for governments who don't have the resources to apply to this issue. We help draft language for them to say at meetings. We help draft resolutions that are adopted. We're not seen. We don't speak at the meetings, although we'd like to. We're behind the scenes, but we are the conscience of the public. We are representing the electorate who elects these officials, who makes these decisions. So be active. Send those letters, like I said. Work with conservation groups. Tell your government, and not just your government, like I said. Work with conservation groups. Tell your government, and not just your government. I know you're all US citizens. Maybe there are some Dutch people. I think I heard there was a Dutch school on this webinar. Your government is awesome, but they can always do more. So help us help governments to do the right thing for whales, and for the environment in general, not just whales. Bridget asks, why are the tourists the ones consuming the whale meat rather than locals? Because they're stupid. I mean, the locals have no interest. They don't have a culture of eating whale meat, at least not minke whale meat. In Iceland, there's no interest in it. I mean, they eat some. I think I read that 3% of Icelandic nationals eat whale meat 6 times or more a year, so it's very small. But people are going on a holiday. They're going for an experience. They want the whole experience. So apparently there are enough people who want the experience not just of seeing whales out on the ocean. They want to see what they taste like too. And of course the restaurants are very happy to cater to that. And there is an effort by local NGOs, awesome effort, to running a campaign called Meet Us, Don't Eat Us. So encouraging tourists to, yes, please go whale watching, bring revenue to Iceland's economy, bring revenue to Iceland's whale watching industry. But don't be a moron, go and eat whale meat. They don't say that, I'm saying that. Go and eat whale meat afterwards. So Plymouth, yes. Stormy, yes, I know. And the Centre for Coastal Studies, yes. So I used to work for Whale and Dolphin Conservation, which is based in Plymouth. So I used to work with Regina and the crew there until about 3 years ago. So yes, I've spent some time in the Plymouth office of Whale and Dolphin Conservation, and I know Stormy and the centre. What am I doing for time? I've got 3 minutes. Maybe I need to wait for Deb to tell me to shut up, but I'll keep going until then. Let me just check there's nothing at the end here. Deb, keep going. Okay. Somebody asked me, and I don't see it now, about whale wars. So this is a controversial. I always get asked this question. I always hate it, but I have to be honest and answer it. So for those of you who don't know, there's a conservation group called Sea Shepherd that has as its tactic to interfere with whaling operations. So then they're non-violent, but their mission is to send vessels down to Antarctica to get in the way of the whaling boats, and to basically stop. So there's the big mothership, the factory ship, and then 3 or 4 catcher boats. If you can get in the way of that slipway that goes up the back of the factory ship, doesn't matter how many whales they catch, they can't load them. So Sea Shepherd's mission has been basically to stop the whaling, stop the loading of those whales onto the factory ships. And they have really pissed off Japan. Whether it's been helpful, I mean, it's obviously, and I congratulate them for saving the lives of many, many whales and bringing a lot of attention to the issue. They are really brave people. I've got to give them a huge amount of credit for that. Whether it's been helpful on the political sphere to have upset Japan quite as much, I don't know. within the IWC meetings. You can't hear me very well. Can you, sorry, maybe I should sit forward. Whether it's been helpful in the IWC meetings to have Japan so angry about being physically attacked. I mean, the whaling, the interactions have become more aggressive between both Sea Shepherd and the whaling fleet, and it's, yeah, someone's going to get killed down there if this doesn't stop. So I've got mixed feelings about it. Maybe that doesn't answer your question. Do we have any more? Can you, Plymouth, can you hear me? Sorry, I was leaning back a little. Maybe my microphone wasn't picking up my voice. Plymouth, can you hear me? Yes, good, okay. So I saw a question. It's hard to read these from Arizona. Maybe I'm going to find that one again. Where is it? Hello from sunny Arizona. My 8th grade class at Wilson Elementary want to know what species of whale is the most endangered at this point. The most endangered cetacean, not whale, is a little porpoise that's endemic, which means it only lives in the Gulf of California, in Mexico. Tiny range. And we're down to the low hundreds now because of interactions with fishing nets, shrimp fishing nets. Shrimp that we eat in the US coming from Mexico, those vaquita, that vaquita porpoise is being caught in those nets. And if the government of Mexico is taking steps finally to deal with illegal fishing and to not have fishermen not use particular nets. But that porpoise is down to very low numbers. Some serious effort is needed to stop that species going extinct. We have lost one dolphin species. We lost the baiji, which was a river dolphin. So dolphins do live in rivers too. They're adapted. Evolution has adapted them to live, some species in fresh water. And there was a dolphin species that lived in the Yangtze River in China. And as a result of overfishing, entanglement in fishing nets, and then the construction of a series of gorges, a series of dams on the Three Gorges River, we lost it a few years ago. That was the first cetacean species in recent history to have been lost. Most endangered big whale, well, the blue whale is still recovering slowly. You know, it is doing better, but as I said, slow breeding animals, it's happening slowly. One close to home, not close to Arizona, but close to Plymouth, is the North Atlantic right whale, which was significantly overhunted in commercial whaling, never really got a chance to recover. And this is what WDC, Whale and Dolphin Conservation, the NGO I used to work for, based out of Plymouth, very active in. So that, you know, we're again down to a couple of hundred. Every birth is important, every death is important when you're down at those sorts of numbers. And those whales are being impacted by fishing gear, getting entangled in fishing gear, getting caught in lobster pots, crab pots. Their migratory route or their feeding grounds are right smack in the middle of major traffic, you know, commercial vessel routes in and out of East Coast ports. So the North Atlantic right whale is in some serious trouble. It's hard to say on a species by species basis because we don't just deal with species. We deal with, you know, there's a species, there is the fin whale, but there are populations and then there's subpopulations. So we tend to designate the status of those animals at that lower population level rather than the overall species level. But it's safe to say the blue whale is still not in great shape, but better. We won't be hunting it anytime soon for sure. Okay, I think I've had all the, oh, hang on, sorry, this thing keeps flipping around. Let me just click rather than scan. Anybody got any other questions? I think I've answered them all. How are fisheries regulated in international waters outside of the IWC? So you mean fish rather than whales, Stephanie? Well, so if you could answer with, yeah, in general. Okay, so fisheries tend to be regulated on a regional basis, which just makes sense because fish are not global species. So we have what we call regional fisheries management agreements that you would hope all the range states of any particular fish species or population would join. And a bit like the IWC, they will study, there'll be a scientific committee that studies the status of those fish. So maybe just the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization, for example, there's a scientific committee that studies the status of the fish in that region. And then based on the status, they'll create mathematical models that calculate what a sustainable removal would be based on the life history of those fish and the numbers of those fish, and then would assign quotas. And as I've said, fisheries agreements tend to be ones that make their decisions by majority vote rather than by consensus, because it's competitive, just like it was back in the whaling heyday. It's, everybody wants as many fish as they can get, so management has to be closely regulated, and it is always. One thing that's unique about the IWC is that it doesn't just regulate whaling on the high seas, so the seas that belong to no nations. It also, actually, its jurisdiction, so that means its legal coverage, actually covers all the way up to the shoreline. So the IWC could set quotas in countries' coastal waters. But of course, as I was giving you the example of Russia and Japan, the countries that want to take that quota would then have to agree between themselves how they were going to divvy up the catch limits quotas. So we've gone past an hour now. I've actually got another conference call I've got to go on to. I can be a little bit late, but unless there are a lot more questions. Okay, thank you, Deb. So the question I was going to answer about unintentional harm to whales, maybe you could send me, I'll type my email on the whiteboard. Does that work? I'll type. Oh, how do I do that? No. Don't know how I do that. Can someone tell me how I type? Yeah, there's an A in front. There we go. Sue Fisher,